Hey there everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian, and boy do I have one for you today. This is one that's I'm gonna be traipsing all over town for this one, so it's likely going to be shot on different days. I'm going to look considerably different throughout this video. My apologies in advance, but I go to certain areas, certain pockets when I do these episodes, and so I shoot some here on a day, I shoot some over there on another day, I shoot some over there on another day. That's just how it is for me to best utilize my time. But in this case, I'm on literally the southern fringe of downtown Portland. It's all behind me back here. Trying to get towards the vicinity of where 4th Avenue crosses over Highway 26 that runs just ahead up here. Because that is the approximate location way back in the day of where the 4th Street Bridge was located. And I got really confused about this. I did another video about a husband and wife murder that I did from pretty close to the same time as this. And I was led astray. It wasn't my fault. I mistakenly was led to believe that the 4th Street Bridge was located roughly in the vicinity of where the Markham Bridge is located. Just because I couldn't really find any good information, and then I was alerted to the fact that it's roughly where 4th Avenue crosses Markham Gulch, which Markham Gulch, Highway 26 runs right through the middle of that. So who would have thought the 4th Street Bridge would be where 4th Avenue is? What a concept. I don't know if I'm going the right direction. Anyway, this is a new episode of Historic Murders of Portland. Currently coming up to 4th, so 4th is the crossing street at this intersection up here. So if you turn and go this way, the 4th Street Bridge would have roughly been located right over here. And this is where they con you. You think you can just go around this way? No, you can't. That just leads you astray. You gotta cross the street to get down 4th, but you can already see it kind of. There's a bridge right there, 4th Avenue crossing over. And as I am finishing my approach to where 4th Avenue today crosses a section of what I don't think it's still regarded as Markham Gulch. Maybe it is by some. But yeah, right behind me here, you see this bridge crossing over. That's where 4th Avenue crosses today, so I can only assume the 4th Street Bridge was comparable to the location of this one. But you'll note from the downtown area behind me, the city, and then of course you got kind of the West Hills starting up here, and then it kind of dips down through here where the highway goes through. This is more or less, and then kind of continuing off that way, the Markham Gulch area that filled in through here, just kind of wrapped around the southern fringe of Portland. And early morning hours of October 24th, 1907, approximately 12:50 a.m., a man named Harry Logan, who just gotten himself a nice job with the railroad, he was walking across this bridge, and partway across he was encountered by a robber. And so naturally, when Harry Logan was gunned down on the 4th Street Bridge, he was left there to die. The man who shot him fled the scene. A coat was later recovered near the crime scene, deemed to belong to whoever was responsible for shooting Harry Logan. Logan was picked up. He was quickly rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital. All efforts were made to save his life, but alas, he was a goner, unfortunately. But before he passed, he was able to give authorities at least something of a description of what happened. He said that, trying to avoid the wind, which is impossible. He said that right before he died, he said a masked man tried to hold him up. And he actually knocked the man down. Like, he tried to fight the man off, which ultimately, that's how you ultimately end up getting killed, is when you try to be confrontational to people with guns. The man then quickly got up and fired 2 quick shots into Logan's body. One was right above the heart and the other in the elbow. The one that entered near the heart was obviously the one that ultimately killed him. He likely bled out, and by the time they got him to the hospital, there was no hope of saving him. So the Portland police had a bit of a murder mystery on their hands. So I'm now about 2 blocks away from the bridge. It's pretty much diagonal from here, right off in this direction. And this very much changed over time. Urban Renewal did a number on this area, and the road just kind of, this road wraps around this way, this one wraps around the other way, but right behind me where this mess kind of begins and this little roundabout is, this is the approximate site of where 2nd and Sheridan would be. And Harry Logan lived on this block, so at one point he had a house standing right somewhere in this vicinity. This is where he lived. And this actually brought up an interesting point when people were trying to understand what happened to him on that bridge, because if he lives here, we're just south of the bridge, which is located up there. Downtown's on the other side going north. Well, Harry Logan was walking north, crossing the bridge. It's almost 1 in the morning, and the presumption was always that when he was crossing that bridge, he was on his way home, but he was going the wrong direction. So where was he going? I mean, obviously we'll never know, because he's not there to tell us where he was going to next at 1 in the morning. But yeah, this is where Harry Logan's home was. There is nothing remotely resembling a home around here anymore. Now, the first suspect that really kind of came up in this case was a guy named R.J. Lawrence, who worked at the Imperial Hotel in downtown. I think he worked like the Turkish baths there, one of my most favorite hotel buildings, old buildings in Portland. And he apparently had a criminal history and reportedly had been on a drinking binge around this time that Harry Logan was killed. And it was reported that he did not come home the night that Logan was murdered. So what does that mean? We don't know. And he was actually arrested the day after Harry Logan's murder in an unrelated charge. He got into a fight, got into a tussle with somebody, got arrested. Police were probably looking at him thinking this guy's got a criminal record. He's probably got a bit of a temper, a bit of a short fuse, but it was kind of generally thought that this guy was a suspect of convenience. Nobody really seriously thought this was the guy, and he kind of fell off the radar pretty quickly. But if we fast forward to October 27th, in this area I don't know what's waiting me around the corner, but anyway, 3 days after Harry Logan's death, October 27th is a very intriguing day. Two things of real significance happened. One, a potential correlation to this case. A young woman named Susie Thompson is traveling along Cornell Road, which is west side, northwest of downtown. It's one of those roads that kind of runs into the West Hills and takes you out of the city, due west of town. Somewhat secluded now, which means it was probably pretty secluded back then. Thompson said she was approached by a man who wanted her help. She was sketched out by him. She bailed, and he started shooting at her. She managed to escape, but people thought, because there was a lot of correlations between these two cases, they were only a couple days apart, they didn't know who it was yet. You have this guy who's traveling alone, gets gunned down on a bridge. You have a woman who's traveling alone. It seems like the same thing someone tried to do. So someone thought that maybe these two cases were interconnected. And I don't think they were ever able to fully prove that, but that was kind of where they were going with that. But beyond that, there was this case of this coat. So one of the only clues found at the crime scene was this coat that was discovered underneath the 4th Street Bridge, right under where Harry Logan was shot. It was deemed there had to be some connection to it. And the police went to the Logan residence back around 2nd and Sheridan, where I was before, to show them the coat, see if they recognized it. Was it Harry's? Could it have belonged to the suspect? And while they were there, they actually encountered a neighbor of the Logans who told them to look into a guy named Joe Anderson, who apparently had been in the vicinity, had been close by. He was seen carrying a weapon on him. He was just maybe somebody to look into, you know? So at this point, the authorities have nothing to lose looking into another potential suspect, so they decide, let's look into this Joe Anderson guy. And right away they discovered something kind of interesting. And we're back to the vicinity of what was once 2nd and Sheridan, Southwest 2nd and Sheridan, because as things aren't quite going the way the police want, they don't fully have their suspect. This Joe Anderson is on their radar now, and it is known. Now, there could have been some right up here, but again, it is known that there was a saloon that stood at 1st and Sheridan, which is off that direction. I can't even get over there because I would have to literally dodge traffic and probably get run over because there's never not traffic in this area. But one more block further down that way, there was a saloon. So, you know, it's only a couple of blocks from the bridge. This may have been the saloon that... It's known that Harry Logan managed to stumble his dying self off of the bridge and into a saloon. Now, there was a saloon at 1st and Sheridan down that way called the Bridge Saloon. Maybe that's the saloon he went into, maybe it's not. I don't know. They never, in the newspapers, they never gave a name for the saloon that he ran into. But it is interesting that on that same night, Joe Anderson was seen at the Bridge Saloon. Authorities started looking, you know, once he becomes a suspect, of course, authorities are going to look into an assortment of things about this individual. And one of the things they looked into and discovered about Joe Anderson is that he'd been last seen at the Bridge Saloon the night Logan was killed. And he happened to be wearing the coat that was later found right off the bridge. That was deemed to belong to the person who shot Harry Logan. So, for all we know, he could have been at the Bridge Saloon, and then just a short while later, Harry Logan comes bursting into the Bridge Saloon, choking, coughing, dying, exclaiming as loudly as he possibly can, "I've been shot!" which are apparently the simple words he spoke as he stumbled through the door into the saloon. They got him to the hospital as quick as possible, but it was all for naught in this scenario. So, Joe Anderson just happened to be at a nearby saloon that night too, so regardless of anything else, we know Joe Anderson was right in the area, right in the vicinity of the 4th Street Bridge. And he was a criminal. And for what it's worth, in at least one newspaper report I saw, they said that Harry Logan, earlier that evening, before he ended up on the bridge, he had been at the Bridge Saloon. So whether it was him, that was the saloon he barged into later that night, he was at that saloon earlier. So you think he was at that saloon, he ended up at another one, and then ultimately ended up on the bridge. I don't know the exact time that he would have ended up in that saloon in relation to when he ended up on the bridge. I'm just wondering if him and Anderson just happened to be there at the same time. Because they were both there that night. And Anderson was an ex-convict, lifelong rap sheets. He was also seemed very edgy when he arrived at the Bridge Saloon, you know, around the time Harry Logan was murdered, telling people not to say where he had been. And authorities ultimately got a tip that led them to this block. This is Southwest 8th and Washington, where reportedly Anderson was staying at when he was apprehended. And it's interesting, like, I want to say when I found the original address, it led me to an address a few blocks further east, because they said something about how there was like a ravine or something near this area that pertained to the story, but I'm not seeing anything remotely resembling a ravine or a drop-off in this particular area. But it came to authorities' attention that 8th and Washington, right here, this is where Joe Anderson was staying at, and they went to apprehend him. And there's this crazy story about how Anderson ultimately gets apprehended. He apparently is walking along, sees the police show up, and, you know, knows he's in trouble. He bails into the basement of the place. Law enforcement tracks with him. They chase him into the basement, and he manages to just bail out a window at the last second. And he's literally, he climbs out, and he's just lingering, apparently over some big drop-off, like a ravine or something is how I read it in the newspapers. He's just lingering there, and he's trying to like edge his way along the outside of the house to try to get away or some crazy nonsense. Problem was, when you're trying to escape in such a sensitive situation, you're moving, you know, you're moving like a sloth when you're trying to move like that. So authorities were able to quickly surround the house and ultimately apprehend him before he, you know, did something to hurt himself. If he would have fallen off that edge and down into the ravine, who knows what might have happened. So it was a chaotic situation, and it really stemmed from this chance, the discovery of the coat leading the authorities to Logan's wife, and then a neighbor by chance saying, hey, like, law enforcement, come over here, there's a guy you might want to look into. And this guy was near the scene of the crime, right around when it happened. And he obviously, now granted, the guy does have a history of criminal activity of probably all shapes and sizes. So it's understandable that when the police surround where he is, whether he's running because of a recent murder he committed or for any other type of crimes he's committed in the past, you know, he'd probably try to flee the police anyway, but it's still suspicious that he went to such lengths, almost to the lengths of killing himself to try to get away from authorities. And so, like a lot of other idiot criminals, they bring the coat to Anderson's attention. They got him arrested, they got him downtown, they're trying to figure out what's going on. And they tie the coat to him, which is of course discovered under the bridge, practically at the crime scene. And Anderson admits it's his, and his reason for shedding it, which, you know, just admitting the coat was yours means you admit to being on the bridge at a time really close to when the shooting occurred. His excuse, which is just a bunch of crap, is he shed the coat and got rid of it because he was too warm. Alright, two things. One, if you want to take a coat off, you don't just throw it away. You take it off, you put it on your shoulder, and then you keep it with you. You don't take a coat off because you're too warm and then just drop the coat there and leave it there. Why he left the coat, I don't know. Maybe it was a thick coat and it was slowing him down as he was trying to get away. Maybe in their struggle it got ripped off or fell off. If there was an actual struggle on that bridge, I don't know how the coat ended up there. But second point is, it was October 1908. Now maybe it was a more warmer, humid October than usual, but even, you know, autumns that I've experienced, when it's October and it's nighttime, it's pretty chilly outside. You want a coat if you're going to be out walking around. So this guy's excuse didn't really hold a lot of water, and of course he was trying to just say, yeah, I was in the area, but I didn't do anything. And before we get too far down, and at this point, before we get too far down the Joe Anderson rabbit hole, it is important to mention that the day after Anderson was arrested, another guy named Bob Lucas was arrested. This is a guy who apparently was also at the Bridge Saloon that night when Joe Anderson was there. So if you're talking about time and place, this guy fits just as well as Joe Anderson. I don't know if he had quite the criminal record. And he apparently, the next day, you know, Joe Anderson told them when he arrived at the saloon in the time that would have been right after the murder, like, don't tell anybody I was here. This Bob Lucas guy showed up the next day, and he specifically asked people and personnel there whether police had shown up looking around for anything. He was wondering if there was any police activity going on in that area, possibly in relation to the man who'd been killed just blocks away the night before, and seemingly in relation to a place that he was at. So this Bob Lucas guy actually got arrested. It was considered a possible suspect, but ultimately went aside when they felt, or maybe could prove that Joe Anderson was the more likely suspect. And it's interesting, you know, the police focused in on the robbery aspect of things. Joe Anderson, lifelong criminal, robberies in his past. If Harry Logan was walking across that bridge by himself with nobody else around. He was a victim of opportunity, and Joe Anderson could have easily tried to rob him. Logan fought back, as the story seems to be, and in that scuffle, Anderson shot him. Now, Harry Logan's wife said that she actually had a different perspective on why he was attacked. And it was in relation to the fact that Harry Logan had literally just obtained work, railroad work. And apparently it was a very coveted position that a lot of men were vying for, which when you get that position, you can create a lot of resentment from other people around you that maybe felt they deserved that job, or just screw it, I want that job and you got it, so I don't like you. And yeah, Harry Logan's wife was thoroughly convinced that the reason her husband was killed was she was killed by somebody who wanted that position, or maybe who saw themselves as being the next in line, and if they got Logan out of the way, that individual could step in and take that position. It was all a fight over a job, which again, police ultimately didn't agree with, and it didn't seem Joe Anderson fit into that possible motive. So authorities kind of brushed Harry Logan's wife's perspective by the wayside and stuck with Joe Anderson, who obviously had a lot of, evidence against him in this case. So it's November 1907. Joe Anderson goes on trial for the murder of Harry Logan, and he tries to play a little game. It's a little game that a lot of criminals, especially ones going on trial for murder, have tried to play, and it's the I suffered trauma at some point in my life that makes my memory hazy. It's a way of conveniently not pleading innocence or guilty. So if you did do it, you're not saying you didn't do it, but if you did do it, you're not admitting to doing it. Very common at this time. And Joe Anderson essentially blamed all of his criminal activity, all of his life's troubles. He said before all this rough stuff started, he had suffered some injury, some trauma in his life, and that kind of turned him sideways and led him down this new path, this life of crime that he'd been down, and it adversely affected his memory. It affected him in all assortment of different ways. And so he blamed this trauma that kind of messed with his mind, along with the fact that he said he'd been drinking a lot that night. He was, it seemed he was saloon hopping, possibly. And so he blamed that mix for essentially not having a memory of what happened that night. Again, a convenient way of not pleading guilty or innocent. And he admitted he'd been in the area. He admitted, yes, the coat that was found at the crime scene was his, that put him at the crime scene around the time it happened. But his memory, he just drew a blank in relation to everything else, which this was a fairly cold-blooded crime. This was the attack and murder of a man who was just perceivably walking home or walking somewhere. Wouldn't it be strange if he was walking on his way to doing something really nefarious and this guy ended up stopping him by chance? Because it's still one of the big questions about this thing is, why was Harry Logan walking away from his house? When he was crossing the bridge, he was going the opposite direction of where he lived. He was going north on the bridge when he lived just south of the bridge. But the fact of the matter is, even if you can argue an accidental shooting, like there was a scuffle that happened and the shooting happened as a result of that, the whole thing still happened because Joe Anderson or whoever it was decided to go up and rob a guy. It begins and it ends there. So Joe Anderson was not going to get away with this, regardless of what he had to say about his memory and his mental state. Oh man, a Riviera. My dad had this exact same car. So that one looks like it's been sitting there for a while. Anyway, nostalgia over. Come February 1908, Anderson's on trial for first-degree murder. He is convicted in less than 30 minutes. So, even by the jury's end, they were they were pretty convinced that what this guy did was in cold blood, to the point that even though it seems like there may have been a scuffle, the shooting may have been the result of that scuffle, it could have been a robbery gone wrong, he maybe didn't intend on shooting this guy. It was just such a violent crime that they deemed that he should be convicted rather quickly of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to be executed. And he actually got a brief stay of execution, but he would ultimately be hung. I got the exact... They loved writing detailed articles back in the day about when people got taken to the chair or when they got taken to get hung. They would give you every little minute-by-minute detail in the newspapers. It's really interesting but creepy as all hell at the same time. And Joe Anderson, for the murder of Harry Logan on the 4th Street Bridge, was hung at 12:32 p.m. July 2nd, 1909. So you see, he was gonna be executed in like the spring of 1908, and it took a whole other year for him to be hung. His last words, because he was retried and found guilty again, his last words before he was hung were, "If I killed Logan, I was not conscious of it." So even as they were getting ready to take him to the noose, he still implied that he'd had traumas, that he had mental issues mixed with booze, made him forget what happened. And he stuck by that to his death. And you know, when someone's facing the death penalty, and it's gonna happen, this is the end, and they stick with that story, it almost kind of makes you want to believe them. Like Sirhan, who went to prison for killing Robert F. Kennedy. He had a similar story. He has denied, since the assassination over 50 years ago, having any memory of doing it. After 50 years, you think he would crack, but he hasn't, and I personally believe him in that case. So maybe Joe Anderson was telling the truth, and maybe this was just a result of a mental break fused by alcohol that drove him to rob or potentially attack Harry Logan. But the authorities felt like they had their man, and this was the guy. And obviously the jury convicted him super quick. They thought they had their man too. So whatever the case, Joe Anderson is the guy that will go down as the man who ultimately was deemed the murderer of Harry Logan back in 1907. And that is that story, another one. Thank you again, as usual, always, for watching. As I keep churning these out, I appreciate your guys' support as I keep making more and more of these, and more of these. And as always, remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, hit up my Patreon, la-di-da-di-da-di-da. And until next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland.